Backwash and Lower Backwash, Growing Up in a Small New England Town, by Robert C. Mitchell, Jr. Preface. With malice towards none and charity towards all. Abraham Lincoln. This book is about my childhood and teenage years in a small New England town. Much of it is based on fact and personal observation, some on my impressions as well as stories heard from others. It is nostalgic and somewhat devoid of the negative and the hard truths of the period covered, roughly 1932 to 1951. But most of all, it is about the village and its people who helped me to shape my value system, my political beliefs, my life goals, and basic point of view. Of course, most important in this process was my immediate family: father, mother, brothers, sisters, grandparents, aunts, and uncles. In addition, others did much to help me: my teachers in public school, Sunday school, college, and the School of Hard Knocks, my minister, my work associates, my friends, and a host of others who touched my life in various ways, some directly and some indirectly. This is a story about a way of life that no longer exists, of people who have passed on but are still vividly remembered, as well as people who are still alive and who continue to have the same kind of positive impact on the lives of others. This, then, is an attempt to give some of the flavor and essence of life in a different time. The young can compare the past and the present. Those older can compare it with similar situations and people who were important in their lives. The names of Backwash and Lower Backwash were coined by my father. Dad always enjoyed giving names to places and things. These are often far more descriptive and or meaningful than their actual names. My brother and I usually called places and things by Dad's names rather than their real ones, because we like Dad's names better. During the story, a number of Dad's descriptive labels will be used, and I will give him full credit for all of them. In looking back, nearly all of the incidents depicted in this story are positive. That is because I'm an eternal optimist. The glass is always half full, and when you get manure for a Christmas present, there must be a pony nearby. Of course, there were many negative incidents during this period of time. They also contributed to my development. Luckily, I have far more positive memories than negative. Perhaps this is the result of optimistic filtering. All of the incidents described had an effect on me. Some of these I remember in great detail, others are merely impressions because of limited involvement or the effects of time, age, and or memory. And some are based completely on experiences and teachings of others. All, however, were part of my life. So let's look back at a time that was, at best, bittersweet. A time covering the Great Depression, World War II, and the post-war years up to the outbreak of the Korean War. As the narrator on The Lone Ranger, one of my favorite radio programs, said at the beginning of every show, let us return now to those thrilling days of yesteryear. Chapter 1. Lower Backwash. I consider myself extremely lucky. Most of my growing years were spent in Backwash and Lower Backwash, Massachusetts. Backwash at the time was a small, isolated village. Lower Backwash was much smaller, very rural, and more isolated. However, even with their isolation, they were relatively close to a large city and to a number of smaller ones. So living there was the best of both worlds. My father has been a very strong influence on me all my life. He is intelligent, a seeker of knowledge, hardworking, dependable, honest, and interestingly, a liberal in politics and a conservative in his personal aspects of life. Dad was willing to have the government spend billions of dollars for the welfare of all citizens, as well as the betterment of our nation and the world, but was very careful with his own personal financial resources. Even though my grandfather was a white-collar worker, a company man, Dad was a union man, through and through. Not just a supporter, he was active in his local union. During his working years, he held a number of local posts in the IBEW, International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. As I vaguely remember, even before I really knew what a union was, he spent many hours talking to me about the need for strong unions to fight the bosses who, he felt, were interested in only two things: profits and complete control of their workforce. Behind strong labor unions, he believed, there must also be a strong liberal political party in power, both nationally and locally, which would provide the legislative and executive support much needed by labor and working people. The Great Depression did much to form, shape, and eventually solidify these beliefs, most of which he still holds in his mid-80s. I was born in 1930. Life in the early 30s, all nostalgia aside, was extremely difficult. The stock market had crashed. Jobs were almost non-existent for millions wanting work. There was a general feeling of hopelessness across the country. Even the movies of the period were gray and gloomy. The Republican administration was hesitant to initiate any radical anti-depression measures, especially at the grassroots level. Their approach to the nation's severe economic problems was perceived to be wait and see. They seemed to convey the approach that down business cycles do occur from time to time. This was to be expected in a capitalistic society. Things are best when left alone. Trying to change things artificially, especially through government interference and involvement, would just make matters worse, and the economy, however, will right itself if left alone. Just give the ailing economy time. Things will get better. Remember, big government programs are bad for the country. Let the natural forces work. Prosperity is just around the corner. Unfortunately, during this wait-and-see period, the Depression continued to worsen. Luckily, my father had a job. He was working for the railroad when I was born, as were my two grandfathers. Dad did not attend college, although he wanted very much to go. There was just no money for higher education. However, he believed that additional education was a critical key to survival in hard times. He read a great deal, with heavy emphasis on current national and international issues, political, social, cultural, philosophical, and historical, as well as on technical books and articles. He knew without doubt that he needed some competitive advantage over the millions of un- and semi-skilled workers across the country who would soon be losing their jobs or were out of work at the present time. Technology was his answer. Dad chose a career in electricity, studying to be an electrician as an electrician's helper on the railroad. Actually, he was an apprentice, working on passenger car lighting. Air conditioning was added later to his job responsibilities. 10 years before retirement, he moved to locomotives, working on their electrical components. In addition to the training he received on the railroad, he continued outside courses to improve his skills. Dad must have chosen right. He was never without a job during the entire Depression, but always feared he might be. Mother was only 18 when she and Dad married on Christmas Eve 1929. I came along 10 months later. Mom came from a middle-class family with strong roots in New England. Her father held a management position on the railroad. She was strong, loving, friendly, loyal, optimistically outgoing person. Mom always was willing to help others. She worked very hard and was an excellent organizer. Most important, she had an excellent sense of humor. She was the kind of person everyone loved because she always gave love back twofold. In dealing with people, I always tried to be like my mother. Several years before I was born, Dad formed a strong friendship with a co-worker named Frank. Frank was from Sicily. He came to this country as a young married man. Though the two men were from very different backgrounds, they believed both in the labor movement and the need for progressive government. They believed that with the Republicans in power, there'd be little or no government support for unions and workers. So they decided to take the initiative so that they could build a better life for their families. To accomplish this and to lessen the impact of potential unemployment, they bought a small farm deep in the country, about 20 miles from Boston. Frank had been saving for some years, and his financial contribution towards the purchase was more than 90%. Dad would pay Frank in a small monthly amount towards a more equitable ownership of the farm. On the farm's 20 or so rocky, sandy acres, there was a house, a small barn, along with woods and meadows, and about half a mile of frontage on a small river. A rutted, bumpy, muddy in the winter and spring, dusty in the summer and fall, dirt road connected the farm to the main road, which was a two-laned and hard-topped. The farm also came with an unconventional cow, some geese, and lots of open land to be prepared and worked. The farm bordered on a bay or backwash of the river. Dad was quick to name the entire local area along the river Backwash because of the many bays along its course. A smaller portion around the farm was dubbed Lower Backwash. The name suited the place. Lower Backwash was about 2 or 3 miles square with no stores, no public buildings, but it did have a railroad station. This was very important as Dad and Frank commuted daily by train to their jobs in Boston. At the time, only 5 or 6 farm families lived in Lower Backwash. A German couple, 2 Polish families, a Finnish family, Frank's family, and ours. All the farms were small, but each had its own agricultural specialty. When the wind was right, you could pretty accurately determine what some of these specialties were. Lower Backwash may have been rural, but it certainly was cosmopolitan and diversified. Dad and Frank had, in fact, formed a very small commune. They both worked very hard to make their farm a success. All too often, however, their work in the fields was disrupted by the crazy cow. In the warm months, she would break or slip her tether and amble into the river to cool off. She would sit down to enjoy the soothing, cool water and the soft, oozing mud of the wash. Frantic wives would send one of the kids running to tell the men the cow was in the river. Disgustedly, the men would leave their work and trudge back to the house. After taking off their shirts, shoes, and socks, they would wade into the muddy river after the wayward cow. The cow's unnatural behavior usually occurred as milking time neared. Dad truly believed that the cow was part water buffalo. Some of my earliest memories were of the 2 men and Frank's older son, Joe, trying to drag the angry, stubborn cow out of the water. The swirling mud, the defiant moves, the splashing, the shouting in 2 languages, and eventually, after a loud sound of releasing suction, out of the river she would come, still fighting every step. She would be covered in black, thick mud. Several uprooted white water lilies were usually hanging from her horns and or draped over her back. Even so, she was definitely not your vision of an emerging water nymph. After a thorough washing down with many buckets of water, the cool and clean cow would calmly be led to the barn, where one of the women waited patiently to milk her. Then there was the time the cow really went crazy. One day, without any apparent reason, there was loud mooing coming from the barn. The 2 city-bred farmers did not truly understand what was the cause of the ruckus. They investigated and found no visible physical reason for her behavior, no wounds, no slivers, bumps, or bruises. The shared opinion was summed up by Frank. He's a crazy cow. She went on for a day or so, getting more and more upset. By this time, she had started to kick the side of the barn. She began to bellow. Her sounds could no longer be termed mooing. Dad and Frank thought she must be sick. They decided to check with Mr. Schultz, who owned the next farm. Plus, Mr. Schultz's specialty was dairy cows. Around 50 at the time, he could easily have been a model for a German travel poster as a kindly and wise man of the soil. Or with a larger mustache, he could have doubled as the Kaiser. But most important, he had far more experience in bovine matters than did the two railroad men. Without giving an answer to their excited story and questions, he put on his coat and went out to his barn. The two distraught neighbors followed closely behind. Dad and Frank were hopeful Mr. Schultz would solve their problem with some magical old-world all-cure or tonic. In Mr. Schultz's barn on the shelf were a number of old dusty bottles of various sizes and shapes. But instead of reaching up for one of these bottles, Mr. Schultz took down his thick, black, coiled bullwhip from a wooden peg just below the medicine shelf. Entering the barn proper, in the first stall was the largest bull the two men had ever seen. The bull, hearing the men approach, began to snort and paw the earth floor of his enclosure. Calmly, Mr. Schultz uncoiled his long black whip, and with a mighty snap of his arm, sent the long bullwhip out to its full length, resulting in a very loud crack. The bull stopped his snorting and pawing almost instantaneously. The raging bull had become a docile puppy. Smiling, Mr. Schultz said in his heavily accented English, "Before you can work mit this bull, you must first his attention get." Armed with his bullwhip, Mr. Schultz untied the bull, attached a rope to his nose ring, and led him out of the stall, the barn, and into the dirt road leading to our farm, approximately 3/4 of a mile away. As they walked along the road, they presented an interesting picture. The docile bull, Mr. Schultz with his coiled whip humming a faintly familiar German song, and the two nervous neighbors who thought at any time Ferdinand would return to his snorting, vicious self. The two women and the 5 kids, Frank's 4 and me, watched in awe as the entourage came into view. When the bull was sighted, all of the women and the kids ran into the house to watch cautiously from the windows. Mother and Teresa, Frank's wife, had thoughts pretty much duplicating their husbands. Past the house and down to the barn, or what was left of it, moved the 3 men and the bull. The cow continued to bellow. In the house we could hear her loud, angry kicks again and again against the splintered wall of the barn. The 3 men and the bull disappeared into the barn. Soon the bellowing ceased. Then the barn began to shake as if an awful earthquake had hit it. The walls shook and the roof lost several shingles. The large barn doors slid back and forth on their runners. This was more frightening than the bellow and the kicking. Finally, the shaking ceased. All was quiet inside the barn. The bull and the 3 men emerged from the barn. Dad and Frank thanked Mr. Schultz, and he accepted their thanks. We saw Frank reach into his pocket and take out his billfold and pay Mr. Schultz some money. As Mr. Schultz led the bull, who appeared to be smiling, down the road, he called back to Dad and Frank, "Mit the fun, there must be the pay." While the cow was strange, the geese were vicious. They patrolled the area around the house like a squad of bull-legged Marines. No one entered their self-appointed patrol area without large hisses and a flurry of beaks and wings. In remembering their many varied attacks, I fully appreciated the derivation of the term associated with an unwanted and unexpected personal attack from the rear. But as a very young child, I never did wander away from the house because of those geese. I guess you'd call this tough love in its most basic form. The farm was located about a mile or so from the lower Backwash railroad station. The 2 men walked it twice a day. From the station, the route took them along the paved main road for about a half a mile. At Schultz's farm, the dirt road to the farm went off to the left. It passed through Mr. Schultz's property for more than 300 yards. Where the road passed through Mr. Schultz's pasture, there was a large farm gate to keep his cows in the pasture. There was a second gate at our property line. Both gates had pass-arounds. They allowed 1 person at a time to go around the gate, but were far too tight to allow a cow to pass through. I really enjoyed going through these pass-arounds, as I was on my own for a few seconds, out of reach of Mom. From the second gate at the property line, the road continued through the woods and cultivated fields for about about a half a mile to the house. The gates did not bother Dad and Frank because neither had a car. The farmhouse had what today realtors would call rustic charm. There was no piped-in city water, but it had a tin sink with a large hand pump in the ample eat-in kitchen. Above the sink was a large window that looked out to the river. When the two families moved into the house, there was no indoor plumbing. Behind the house, about 60 or so feet, was an outhouse, a three-holer, surrounded by large lilac bushes. I believe it was there, in the outhouse, that I developed my lifelong acrophobia. To this day, I remember balancing high and unconfidently above that deep and foul-smelling unknown below, scared stiff I would fall in even though my mother kept hold of me. There was a good-sized pantry and storage room off the kitchen, which later became the bathroom when the indoor plumbing was installed. A large dining room and living room and a hallway completed the living area downstairs. There was, in addition, a large unheated storage shed on the back left of the house, which opened into the kitchen. Upstairs there were 4 bedrooms: Frank and Teresa's room, Mom and Dad's room in which I slept in my crib, Joe and young Frank's room, and the 2 girls, Florence and Dorothy, shared the 4th room. Another great memory was once a week Teresa made spaghetti sauce. The smells were wonderful. A great deal of time was spent simmering the sauce or sugar. In the summer, it was made of fresh tomatoes from the garden, and the rest of the year it was made of tomatoes canned by my mother and Teresa and her 2 daughters. In the storeroom, Teresa had her large tins of olive oil, which Frank carried home from Boston's North End. There were hanging strings of garlic, the large canisters of sugar and flour, and the smaller ones containing the many spices, seasonings, and herbs. All of these Teresa used to make her most wonderful sauce. When at long last the sauce was ready, the large pasta pots of water were put on to boil. She always cooked the hot and sweet sausage, meatballs, or pork in the simmering, bubbling sauce. When all was ready, everyone sat down to a hearty appetites. While it was great the first time, the reheated pasta was even better the second and third days. Teresa was a culinary high priestess, and Mom was her devoted vestal. Mom's pasta and sauce came close in later years, but she could never quite match Teresa's. Dad and Frank and Joe worked very hard to make the farm a success. They cleared additional land, plowed, planted, and carefully tended their wide variety of growing plants. Then, when a particular vegetable ripened, everyone helped in the harvest. In addition to all of their work, they even started to dig foundations for a second house. Most of their farm work had to be done on weekends, as this was due to their varied work schedule. With Dad's low seniority, he had to work the night shift. Frank usually worked days. On Sundays, when they were both off and could work together, Dad and Frank would hear the church bells from the much larger Backwash about 3 miles away. To Dad and Frank, the bells truly represented the patriotic and religious town people who were watching and waiting along with the government and praying for the natural order of things to change, bringing back once again the prosperity and positiveness of the 20s. Even with their hard work and dedication, the commune, like so many before and since, failed. After 2 years, my family left the farm and moved into a little house in Backwash. Frank and his family stayed and continued to work the farm. When our little family returned to life in town, overnight, Frank became an agricultural entrepreneur. Later in life, he even voted Republican. Actually, the little farm could support 1 family, but not 2. But though we moved away, our 2 families remained very close friends. I can remember in later years many happy days swimming, boating, and having great dinners at the farm. Everyone in our family always called Frank's place the farm. Long after the last crops were planted, and eventually after retiring from the railroad, Frank sold the farm to a large corporation. Frank lived a long and very happy life and a very productive one, with his wonderful wife Teresa, his 2 sons and 2 daughters. He passed away at age 90. Later behind the house, Frank and his sons built a boathouse on the backwash and bought 5 or 6 old town canoes and several rowboats for rental. Then behind the old barn, the cow and her calf had been sold. They laid out a picnic area with an elevated dance floor and bandstand, several serving stations, and 7 or 8 large tables. Over the years, especially during the Depression years, many private groups rented the picnic area for a summer's day. But those who seemed to enjoy the picnic area and canoes most were the many railroad families who would take the train out to Lower Backwash for an inexpensive, enjoyable Sunday in the sticks. Another major factor in my parents' decision to move to town was that my mother was pregnant with my brother. She felt that the farm was too remote. She wanted to be in a larger community. To compound it all, the railroad was planning to cut down its service to Lower Backwash. Within a decade, all passenger train service to and from Lower Backwash was canceled. For all of these reasons, we moved to Backwash. As you will see, we all, including Dad, soon became very actively involved in the life of that patriotic and religious community 3 miles away. Chapter 2, Backwash. Moving into town was a great change for our little family, especially for me. Instead of one isolated house, there were many houses close together. The roads were all paved, and there were many cars whizzing by the house. Backwash was alive and vibrant compared to the low pace of dusty, rural, Lower Backwash. With streets and cars, there was also a lot of people. It took some time to get used to all the hustle and bustle. Our view of Backwash as a metropolis again proves that all is relative. With all the possible dangers of town, and without the guardian geese, Mom laid down a long list of new rules that had far more don'ts than do's. The result was that I was pretty much limited in my area of freedom to the yard and the house. First of all, our new house was a very small one. It was a single-family dwelling. There were 5 rooms in the entire house. 2 rooms downstairs, a large eat-in kitchen, and a good-sized living room, plus bathroom. Yes, an inside toilet and tub. These modern facilities posed a new problem. Dad found the bathroom was a great place to read, away from the kids and the girls who stopped by to visit Mom. There were 3 small bedrooms upstairs. A door in the kitchen opened to a flight of creaking stairs which led to a creepy, dark basement with a huge spider-like furnace with hot air pipes going to all the rooms in the house. There was a 4-foot-high white picket fence in front, extending from one corner of our house, which was right on the sidewalk, to our neighbor's house on the left, as you looked from the street. Between our house and the house on the right was a narrow alley closed by the same kind of picket fencing. The gate of the picket fence was quite sturdy. I soon found it was a great fun to swing on. Immediately, gate swinging became one of my many don'ts. There was a small side yard, and then the backyard was quite large. The yard was also fenced in. The fencing ran along the boundary lines between the neighboring houses and along the back line as the backyard bordered on a small pond. The only entrance to the first floor was a side door in the kitchen. This door opened onto a small porch with 3 stairs down to a brick walk which led to the picket fence gate. There was a slippery steel bulkhead cellar door, great for sliding down, leading down into the unfinished basement. Chapter 2 is continued on the other side of the cassette. Please fast forward the cassette to the end and then turn the cassette over for the second side. Soon after we moved in, a cadre of kids came to the house asking if I could play.
Joe, Billy, Patty, and Charlie were among the first to visit. They were all a little older than I, but I was used to this, as back on the farm, Frank Jr. was older than I was. Mom was very open and friendly with the kids, as she was with everyone. She welcomed them into the house, and we all had a glass of lemonade. Our house soon became a center of activity for the five of us, mainly because I was too young to leave the yard. While Patty moved away several years later, the three boys were friends and teammates up through high school. Soon after we settled in, Mom and the family joined the Congregational Church. Yes, the one with the large, loud bell that could be heard for miles. Shortly after joining the church, Mom swung into action. Her organizational and take-charge abilities soon came to the fore. For too long, she had been the young, second woman in a large household. Now, she had her own house. She was ready to roll. Within a year, she and several other women in the church founded a group called the Friendly Guild. Its purpose was to support the church in a variety of ways. The Friendly Guild helped to organize the Sunday school, worked on church suppers and bakery sales, visited and provided support for the sick, which included personal visits, food, and limited financial help. And members also visited local and veterans hospitals, nursing homes, and a nearby TB sanitarium. They helped in a number of ways to raise money and distribute money, and good cheer for the church. The women even got the men to help out from time to time. In an old scrapbook, I have a picture of Dad, Frank, his son Joe, and several other men working in the kitchen of the church, cleaning up after a potluck supper. They apparently were having a great time being patriotic and religious. In addition to her Friendly Guild activities, Mother and 7 or 8 other women formed a club. Some of their husbands, like Dad, worked nights. Others were widowed, semi-widowed, or single. The club, that's what they always called it, just the club, met once a month, always on a weeknight for fun, food, talk, and singing. Every 6 or 7 months, the club met at our house. The girls, as they call themselves, always seemed to have a great time. During all of this, my brother was born near the end of 1932. During club meetings, the early part of the evening was spent talking and having something to eat. Later, after refreshments, Marie, whose husband was a hospitalized World War I gas victim, would play the piano. She played by ear with the uncanny ability to play a tune even if she had heard it only once. Because of Marie's ability, the girls were able to sing the latest songs at club meetings, often well before the sheet music reached the music stores. They would sing along with gusto, even without liquid stimulation, still prohibition. Usually, as the evening progressed, they grew louder and louder. One night, I did what was absolutely forbidden. I climbed out of bed and went downstairs, and with a very loud voice, I suggested to the girls they should stop making so much noise. I added that I could not sleep with all the racket, and if I was going to grow up to be strong and healthy, I needed my rest. Actually, I was simply paraphrasing similar words my mother used when she sent me off to bed before dark on summer evenings. I was probably a bit too strong in voicing the suggestion. For my trouble, I received several smart slaps on the bottom and was hustled back up to bed. I never again interrupted the club's fun and frolic, even on school nights years later. Unfortunately for me, I was growing up in the last days of children should be seen and not heard era. However, these club meetings were not all negative. I was able to eat the leftover potato chips and other goodies the next morning before Mom got up. As mentioned, the Friendly Guild, over the years, put on other money-making events in addition to the traditional church suppers and bakery sales. Once a year, they put on a show featuring local talent, singing, playing instruments, poetry recitations. The memorizing of long poems was still in vogue, at least in Backwash, and its public school actively supported this pastime, and so on. Shows of this kind did not draw big crowds even then, and to compound the problem, tickets had to be very inexpensive to get any crowd at all. Many meetings of the Friendly Guild were spent discussing better ways to raise money for the church. One winter meeting, over coffee, tea, and some homemade cookies, someone came up with the idea of doing something using a minstrel show format. The idea passed by acclamation. Immediately, the women began to work on the project. They cast and staged the shows themselves, an all-women show. They brought a local man in for semi-professional help. Ding appeared in minstrel shows in the past, so he knew quite a bit about how they were structured. However, his job was only to provide guidance. He was not the show's director. One of the women was assigned that job. When they were finished, they had selected the end women, Mom was one, Madam Interlocutor, and the chorus, entirely female. The end women were all in traditional blackface, wore overalls, tied red bandanas around their necks, and wore sneakers. The term sports shoes had not yet been invented. Oddly enough, their songs were Irish, Mom, for example, sang Who Threw the Overalls in Mrs. Murphy's Chowder, which I am certain the Christie minstrels never used, old standards and currently popular numbers, rather than the traditional Southern songs that were usually associated with such shows. However, the tambourine selection was done to the accompaniment of an old minstrel song, as strongly suggested by Ding. The jokes were all named by name at local characters, just so there would be absolutely no confusion over who was the butt of the joke. The show was great fun and was a big money maker for the church. With the success of this first effort, these church-sponsored minstrel shows became an annual event in the village. From today's perspective, and by present standards of behavior, putting on a minstrel show would be considered totally wrong and deemed blatantly discriminatory. But in the mid-30s, this was not the case. Naively, these women had no thought whatever of racial prejudice when they produced these shows. They were considered just good fun. In fact, years later, I participated in an all-kids minstrel show. One of the end men in that show was an Afro-American. His participation was totally supported by his large family. In fact, other members of his family were in the chorus. He was made up in blackface and overalls like everyone else. This was simply the costume for end men, and he was an end man, so he wore the costume. Backwash is a great town to grow up in. In the 30s, it was small and somewhat isolated. In fact, in those days, there were no numbered highways, town, county, state, or national, in and out of the village. Only those who really wanted to go there went there. For those wishing to go, they had to have an excellent set of directions. This was crucial. Unthinkable today, but there were no police patrols through the village, although the chief of police for the entire larger township lived in Backwash. Why was this? Simply because there was no crime in the village, except a speeder once in a while, and if such practice continued, several members of the community would personally talk to the offender, and he or she would slow down in the future. There were some kids trespassing into old abandoned houses, or into the old mill yard, or into an apple orchard or two. Doors of houses and cars were left unlocked, toys were left out all night in the open, and people could walk anywhere at night without worry. What was most interesting, everybody simply accepted this and thought nothing of it. The only exception to this unblemished record was Halloween, but more about that later. Backwash proper was quite small. The center was located in a small river valley with streets radiating out from the center into the surrounding hills. In those days, Backwash had one main street and about 9 or 10 tree-lined residential streets and a lot of open land. As was the case in most mill towns, during the 1830s and 40s, the mill owners built homes for their managers, supervisors, and employees. Closest to the mills were the modest houses and tenements of the milled hands, the workers. Living space in those homes was very limited. There were some single-family units, a few two-family, and others were connected blocks of 6 or more dwellings, similar to those found in Welch mining villages today. In the 1930s, many of these buildings still remained. Some had families living in them. The supervisor's homes started at the base of the South Hill and continued up the hill. These were more distinctive homes, usually 2-storied, single-family, although several were two-family houses. They, too, were within short walking distance of the mills. Large boarding houses had been built for the single workers, male and female. but by the 1930s most of these had been razed, abandoned, or converted into family apartments. The merchants and professional people lived in larger homes scattered along the tree-lined streets on both hills. Other houses, large and small, were intermingled throughout the town, with those built by the mill owners, the merchants, and professional people. Thus, on any street, there could be a wide range of household incomes. Very few of the large mill owner homes remained. One in particular was an especially attractive large white mansion which stood at the top of North Hill, overlooking the village. 3 stories high, with a large turret-like tower rising above the 3rd floor level at the front of the house. In addition, it had a large stable with a full turnaround for horse and carriages and a large formal garden. In the early 1900s, the mill owner moved out of the mansion and it was converted into an apartment hotel for visiting dignitaries. A story circulated that a famous song written in the early 1900s had been written there when it was an apartment hotel. By the 1930s, it was unoccupied and falling to ruin, but impressive even in decline. There were hills for skiing, tobogganing, and sledding, a small, meandering, but still dangerous river for swimming, fishing, boating, and skating, several ponds for finding turtles, swimming, and such, brooks to follow and catch fish, and a swamp for getting drenched when failing to make a successful jump from one grassy clump to another. The swamp was also a great place for laying out secret trails which led to special secret places where you could catch fish or just lay down in the grass, looking up, searching for cloud animals, people, and such in the sky. There was a playground close to the town center which offered a variety of activities in the summer months. In addition, there were many abandoned mills and other buildings, included a haunted house for exploration and discovery. Happily, there were lots of kids to share this all with. Although small and secluded, the village was a very vital place, having a long and interesting history. The first settlers arrived in the mid-1640s. The village had brushes with Indians and witches. Indians attacked the village several times in the 1600s, killing several people with each raid. Backwash was involved in the 1692 Salem witchcraft trials when the clairvoyant girls from Salem came to the township to determine what or who was tormenting a Backwash woman. A number of women from the township were pointed out by the girls as witches and were transported to Salem for trial. Several were hung. During the trials, it was stated that the witches of Essex County flew on their broomsticks to Backwash for black baptisms and other ungodly acts performed along and in the river that ran through the village. Over the years, citizens of the village answered the call to every war from King Philip's to World War II. As the years passed, Backwash men and women actively participated in all subsequent wars fought by the United States, large and small. Industry came in the 1830s. The river proved to be an excellent source of power to run the mills. Before the Depression, 4 or 5 woolen and cotton mills were still running, plus a large iron file manufacturer and assorted small factories. All of these were closed or greatly curtailed in their activity by 1936. Long before the mills closed, most of the rich people had moved away. As in many small New England villages, the families who owned the mills gave their names to streets, ponds, buildings, and local schools. However, as the years passed, more and more people in Backwash could not associate these names to anyone they knew or had known. Probably this is what Longfellow meant by footprints in the sands of time. Who the hell's footprints were they anyway? When I was growing up, Backwash had 3 grocery stores, a meat market, 3 churches, Congregational, Methodist, and Catholic, a branch post office, a large brick public school, a barber shop, a gas station, a playground, a firehouse, a small nursing home, and a community building. Housed at the bottom of the community building were the meat market and one of the grocery stores. On the middle floor, the branch public library, the precinct room, polling place, Boy and Girl Scout rooms, and on the 3rd floor, a relatively large auditorium where the minstrel shows and other entertainments were held. Backwash also had a large, musty railroad station with a long platform and 2 baggage sheds. In the center of the hamlet there was a large, round, functioning water trough dedicated to the Grand Army of the Republic.